Together with her partner, Ron Witte, she directs the architectural practice WW, based in Houston, Texas. Dean Whiting, who many of us refer to simply as Sarah, has established herself as a champion of architecture and its disciplinarity. Like a handful of other women we reference on a first-name basis in architecture's academic circles, Sarah is an impressive force. Her writings and works are stimulating provocations. Indeed, they are acts of architectural thought that swerve and redirect the field. Before, and I repeat, before studying architecture, Sarah worked for the man on the left. And as if that were not enough, after graduate studies at Princeton, she worked for the man on the right. Let's sit with that for a moment. I suspect, pity Sarah. I suspect that anyone with the intelligence and the emotional intelligence to chart new disciplinary ground in the space between these two is someone worthy of our attention, someone fearless, passionate, and principled. On a personal level, I'm tremendously grateful for Sarah's generosity and encouragement, and deeply impressed by her transformative effects on pedagogy and the field. Please join me in welcoming Dean Sarah Whiting.
Sorry, what was that? I heard that, Michael Osmond. What are you saying? Huh? Eh? That was super sweet. I will say I was I remember actually when I heard that Heather had been made chair or had agreed finally to be chair here, and I was very thrilled for you all. I think it's really terrific for UCLA. I'm very happy for the school. It's a school that we have, I think, a very good relationship with, and I feel lucky for that. And so a bunch of you have connections to Rice, and actually I think there's a really strong affinity between the two schools. So this is, I'll lecture, it'll be scripted, I'll read, even though I tell students not to read, and it will be satisfying on a certain level, but not necessarily for the audience. I haven't done that this time, and so I warn you that this is a little bit loose. I at least have an enthusiastic audience, which is good. So this is a talk that has, it's some themes that I've been dealing with for a little while, so I always get nervous that some people may have seen versions of this already on the web, in which case you could not pay attention. But I've made some changes. It's something that I'm still working with, and I will talk, and then I'll show some projects from our office, and I'll show 3 projects. I'll show 4 if I have spoken too fast or haven't staged my time properly. So we'll see how that goes. But since I am a dean, I have to do a little pitch first. So can all the Rice alumni raise your hand? That includes you this come forward. Nice try. Okay. So if you're any undergraduates looking for a great place to go for graduate education, you can talk to any of those people in the audience right now. So, Stanley is very happy to be there. He's a great dog. This is my little pitch for my school. Now I can say I've done that. So we live in interesting times, and I could have picked a far less flattering photo of our president. So it's difficult to say those words, but I chose one that actually will be familiar for tomorrow night's State of the Union, and I encourage everyone to watch the State of the Union tomorrow. I think that we live in interesting times, unfathomable times, right? I think it's a very difficult and interesting moment for the country, but it's one where I think architecture has to be absolutely engaged with the political scenarios of the time. And so that's something that is tied to the topic at hand. So we're in interesting times now. It's a time that's very much in flux, and I was talking with students before about the fact that today it's very difficult to situate the period. When I was in architecture school, this was sort of the um, the context, right? So, and I actually worked on that top building, believe it or not, because I did also work on Roberge for a summer between those two other guys. And that's actually the only place I did redlining, was on the Swan and Dolphin. So if you think of the moment when I was in graduate school, the moment when a lot of the faculty were in graduate school, was the moment when there was a real paradigm at play, and a real paradigm being challenged then by another paradigm. It was a very clear moment and a very interesting one for that. Following that came another sort of paradigmatic battle, let's say, that was quite clear here, and I forgot, as I told students, to put slides for it, but they're sort of boxing blobs today. Right? So we kind of yearn for those moments because the camps were clear, the terms were clear, it made teaching relatively easy, I assume, for the faculty when we were teaching because we had very clear parameters like that. And today we don't have that. We were talking a little bit with the students before, and maybe it's a question of 100 years ago, there was also a moment of kind of flux, though that was ended by World War I, which really defined things very quickly. And maybe that's not the best way to aim for definitions, and maybe that's good. But if you think of the period that preceded World War I, there was a similar moment of lack of clarity, a lack of a singular paradigm. There's something I think interesting about that, though I don't want to subscribe to a kind of 100-year cycle in the solution line. But I think that it's not the first moment that we've had this moment of essentially a lack of clear paradigm. We have right now a series of attempts to kind of define the field. This was Alejandro Zairapolo's global, what was it, Global Architecture Political Compass. This is version 2.0. And this started with Alejandro and his assistant Guillermo Fernando. What's Fernando's last name? Maybe what's Guillermo's last name? So he was teaching me this last year, so I should know. But so this was their attempt. They had 11 categories, and they asked 181 firms to kind of place themselves within those categories, or be willing to be placed in those categories, and where they would sit. And only 15% of only 115 firms did it, and only 15% actually chose the same category that Alejandro and Guillermo had for them. There was another, I think, 5% that said that they should be in another category, or percentage said they shouldn't be categories at all, or I mean, it was sort of this categorization is always difficult, but this is one attempt to try and figure out how to map this incredibly varied field we're in right now, and I have sympathy and interest in this attempt, and I think you can learn a lot from it. They're not the only ones who are doing that. Juan Herreros has also been trying to map the discipline by sort of mapping offices. He's done it. This was something that he started with his collection for the Assembly of the in 2016, and he's working on this still. And for him, it's more a question of finding overlapping practices that are all new collaborative approaches. He's sort of naming 5 different streams of collaborative approaches. The designer of parts as a whole, the designer as social mediator, the designer by email, the designer of prototypes, and the designer as consultant coordinator. Jeff, what's your second? I caught it with USDD. He sort of mapped out these 5 different ways of approaching practice and tried to put firms into those and talking about a different approach. So if Alejandro's trying to set up different ways of categorizing approaches to architecture, this is approaches to how one actually practices. the Chicago Biennial was another attempt at trying to sort of map a field. That's what biennials do, and we have a whole series of practices that were included there, um, often characterized as thin, young men with goatees and very good suits. That's at least what it seemed at the opening. But it was also a sense of sort of situating a practice, and you can see here there were two panels that the GSD held, trying to sort of map out those two fields by looking at practice and looking at history. Or the exhibit that's just opened at the GSD, that is it's architecture before speech. Um, this conversation that's also trying to map out disciplines, and I'll talk about that again a little more in a minute. But these are all essentially attempts to continue the role that that Jenks did this already in 2000, July 2000, in the Architectural Review, his evolutionary tree. But we all have a desire to kind of map out and control have some means of controlling the disciplinary apparatus of our very, very disparate field, which is what makes architecture so exciting, is that the number of routes it can take. And again, I'm sympathetic to this. I'm intrigued by the kind of proliferation of contemporary attempts to map the discipline and create these different graphic versions of it. And I think that there are different strains of that. I do worry, and I was talking about this with the students, I do worry a little bit that it's turning into just a form of offering up options and mapping different alternatives as opposed to really sort of grasping what can happen with those alternatives. So I think one can do only so much categorizing before one is responsible for moving onward. These are four of our own faculty. Again, I'll try the dean card, who are in the GSD show. That's actually a pretty fascinating show, I think, in a lot of ways. The variety of practices that are involved in it, but then the inclusion of every GSD faculty member as well, so I find this a slightly confusing way of trying to capture the moment with the kind of GSD label over it. But I think it's an interesting moment, and I think that though I object to the idea of architecture before speech, because I think that only opens the door to a lack of project or a lack of attempting to articulate the project. I am intrigued by even these four practices of Poisson, of Chantier, Michel Chang, of Yaya, Miji Portalo, of how you see a sort of a consistent interest in certain objects and certain forms that I think are part of what I would be very interested in seeing articulated in that GSD show. So I think the possibility of certain streams being articulated is happening right now. So that's really a sense of laying out my interest in the moment, my belief that there's a shared interest in finding ways of understanding projects or understanding the moment, and my desire to see some people actually lay claim to articulating it. So, the title of this talk is Engaged Autonomy. I'm interested in that topic for two strains. One is the autonomy of the discipline, and the other is the autonomy of the object. So you can sort of you can determine from the two architectural fathers I have, you could say, how that's defined. And yes, both of them influence my interest in autonomy and objecthood. But to what extent, I don't know if we'll make that big a deal out of it. So this comes in part from our inclusion in an exhibit at the Art Institute in 2014. And it was called Chicago Chicagoism, and all the participants were asked to submit models. This is our model here, WW. So we entitled our project, our model, I object or I object, and it was really partly our interest in the object and the fact that the object wasn't being discussed. And so we were allowed to have a text of about 150 words, and you can see what we included with our model there. The model is the texty model below. And so it was really sort of a question of how can you make an object that is at once singular and also has different opportunities for engaging with context through cuts into the project, through its geometry, through its situation on a block. There was an interest in abstraction and an interest in a question about geometry and architecture. So the Chicago Tribune architecture critic, Blair Kamen, called out 3 projects in his review of the exhibit. We were one of them, which is kind of a thrill, right? Except what he said. So he said, include it, he said, so other models, like I Object by Ron Witte and Sarah Whiting of Houston, I think you got that right, provoke with their arrogant defense of buildings as their objects bereft of concern to the urban environment or for saving energy. And I find this a really, really interesting critique because, again, we had 150 words and we were focused on the topic of the object within our discipline and in our making a point about the fact that objects weren't being talked about. That was the point we wanted to make. I actually have great concern for the urban environment and for saving energy, and that wasn't the point or interest of this installation. So I found it very interesting that was immediately, if you discuss and embrace or an interest in the object, you're categorized in a certain way. You're essentially categorized as being irresponsible. So responsibility is seen as someone who's interested in context, someone who's interested in people, someone who's interested in the environment, all of the issues that are pressing in the world today. But if you talk about the object, if you talk about form, if you talk about architecture in those terms, you're classed as irresponsible and so you're just put in a corner. That's super interesting to me, and I think deeply problematic. So if you think of sort of all the mappings of the discipline and all the different ways of practicing, one of my concerns, and even of practicing architectural history, and we talked about this also before, one of my concerns is that if we don't talk about the object, if we don't understand how to make an articulate argument and advance our understanding of architecture as an object, then we're shooting ourselves in the foot. Whatever. In any case, we're screwing ourselves over because that's part of what we do. We traffic in making walls, dealing with materiality, dealing with buildings that are objects in the city, and that's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean that's the only thing we deal with. But so that's the sort of that's the background of my interest, and so the object is where this is headed. So the other context for what I want to talk about tonight is a book that just came out last year by Bob Thomas, who I think is one of the most interesting political theorists writing today. It's called Public Things, which is about objects, let's say, that are a shared system for the public. And she uses the Bruno Latour as an epigraph in the book. So I don't like double negatives. I think it's a really nice quote, because essentially political theory also has this crisis of object, or as they say, the object avoidance tendency, which I think sounds like a really bad syndrome. But that's actually, that's a syndrome that's fallen for our discipline as well. So you can isolate Connick's argument really with this quote that is pretty early on in the book of democracy postulating public things, infrastructure, monuments, libraries that citizens care for, use, repair, and are gathered up by, appraise it, which follows B.W. Winnicott. And so part of what she's saying and part of what I find very interesting, so when we talk about the public in our discipline, we tend to talk about public space. And that's where we're pretty comfortable in our discussions about the public audience for architecture. There's a real clear history in terms of public space, which is the sphere theory. There isn't much history of talking about publics and objects. And this is part of what Hanukk's going after, and realizing that there are certain shared public things in the world that are part of what bring us together as a group of citizens. Now that can be understood in different ways. If you go back to the image I showed of Trump, like the American flag is a public thing that's a symbol that unites. That's not what Hanukk's talking about so much. She's talking about things like tax codes, the Constitution, um, monuments, but also the fact that we have to care for monuments. I love the key tip of Lincoln. Lincoln in the Bardo, by the way, is one of my favorite books of this year, so that's why I was very interested in the Lincoln monument. But essentially she's talking about monuments, bridges, tax codes, the Constitution. She has a segment where she talks about the public telephone groups and how they acted during Hurricane Sandy. They still operated in New York, and they were things that you could say are invisible, but when you need it, you know it's there. There's things that are hiding in plain sight. There's things that actually we have a shared association with, whether they're monuments that are things that we put a heavy association with, or whether they're things like bridges or infrastructures that are shared and you only pay attention to when they're broken. There are things, objects, that define our public shared existence. It's a very interesting argument. And that's part of what I want to use to kind of exploit the possibility that that public objects are something that we can pay attention to. So, I think her collection of examples is clear. The big word is because of how Big Bird was used as a symbol with PBS is going to be defunded, and there was a whole movement. So there was, I forget who it was who derided Big Bird and said that we weren't going to fund it, and then there's a whole movement that eventually got around Big Bird. And so Big Bird becomes a shared symbol or a collective object for a public debate. And part of what Hunting's going after is that these, again, aren't symbols that are easily unified, but are ones that are sort of objects of contestation, or at least consideration when they come into play. So when you take that and think about what that means for today, there are two strains that I want to talk about, sort of to think about how we use that within our field. So one is the sort of problem of the fact that there are things like the wall that is going to discuss, and these are the different prototypes for the border wall. And that's a public object that we should be paying attention to and adding our voices to, because if it's going to be a public object, we have to actually voice our opinions within that discussion. It can't be something that is simply imposed if it's something that we're going to deal with. So partly, let's say, an argument for some public objects are ones that require contestation from the start. Other public objects are, libraries is one that Hanuck talks about, and I think that they are institutions that are very clear public objects in the kind of the role they play in the city and in the collective imaginary. These are early renderings of the Obama Library by William Shen, and I think, again, part of what I think is interesting about Hanuck's argument is a call to enter into that conversation before we simply have the object and we can talk about it afterwards. So those are examples that come straight from Hanuck, right? Infrastructure or libraries. I think there's then a question of what there are private buildings or corporate buildings that do sometimes occupy this role, and I think it's a different way of understanding, or let's say a more nuanced approach to the icon debate. That so I think something like the Gherkin or 30 St. Mary's Act by Foster and Partners is a public object in a way, in that it's defined, it's understood collectively within London, but in a very singular way. So it doesn't have much nuance, and it's also a corporate symbol. And I think that there's an interesting contrast to, obviously, you know my allegiance, I work for it. But I do think actually that CCTV is a very interesting example of okay, the CCTV is a public organization within China, but say it's a private building. I have less issue with the sort of corporate, public nature of the client, and I think what's interesting about CCTV in comparison to the Gherkin is that it is viewed differently from any angle. It offers up a completely changing notion of itself as an object. It's a very hard object to apprehend in a singular way, and I think that that's a rich way of addressing the issue that Connor's putting on the table. So I think that there's a clear contrast with let's say, the singular icon, and the object is something that's less immediately apprehendable. In terms of finding a way where a public object can engage a constituency without singularizing a constituency. In terms of, so there isn't a pretense of a public being a simple singularity. You guys with me? All right. On the one hand, it's super simple. On the other hand, I'm talking a lot, and I can't tell if you're really interested. So, just checking in. So, on that note, so all of that is in the background, right? Because my interest, the way I came to architecture wasn't from design. It was from an interest in political theory and liberal arts. And I'm very interested in the fact that we are all very different people, and somehow we exist in a society together. God knows how, right? I mean, the idea, so whether it's a faculty meeting or whether it's the US government, somehow we have to work together. All these individuals who are completely different people have to work together as a form of society. That's at the basis of my interest in architecture, ultimately, right? And so I'm very interested in how architecture engages a multiple audience all the time. That it's never, you never have your one-on-one. You can never control your audience. Our subject is always multiple, always changing, and I find that incredibly invigorating and also very challenging. So I'm going to talk about some projects from our office with all of this in the background. So, okay. We were invited to do two different competitions for soccer stadiums in Morocco. That's kind of a reach, given that neither one of us is very sporty, and neither one of us has been to Morocco. So, but still, it was a great opportunity. So one was here in Ushda. So it was a stadium for Ushda. The competition was canceled. In fact, both of them were canceled. It's very difficult. Although Morocco is trying to make its way they're trying to be the host for the World Cup, and so there were these opportunities. Ushda is a small city that's near the Algerian border, and the site was actually isolated from Ushda, so it was actually a site sort of in the middle of nowhere. And so part of what we were interested in doing was really sort of defining what it means to form this symbol for Ushda, a new stadium, but also something that has it's a singular object, a singular symbol for the city, but also a big room where a lot of different people come together to watch one ball. I'm not a big sports fan generally, but I find it sort of fascinating that you get all these people who are watching this one ball in one space. I'm sure some of you are interested in soccer. So this is this is sort of the two extremes of what we're dealing with in terms of an object, partly a symbol for the city, and what that means today for symbol set in the context that you're defining. So part of it was actually defining that context through defining a landscape and creating uh, this form of this singular object, this ring, that would hover above the landscape, and then how you create a whole landscape that creates a whole world underneath it that's very connected. And so a series of, I mean, the bus place to all the places where you park, but a series of small landscape areas that could be used when games weren't happening. It could be, you create essentially a new park that would be a complicated landscape of many people coming together to this whole. The structure is a very simple materiality of a silver glazed brick that would be reflective, and so sort of on the one hand be this silver ring that would be a singular thing, but would be capturing the surrounding views of the context. And so you can see that it was the idea of that ring hovering. You come up to a level that allows you to see the landscape. So when you're watching the game, you get a slice of the landscape that's open to you, as well as the view down into the stadium. And so the idea of lifting that ring made the whole, but also attached it to its immediate context. You can see here, so that you're constantly reminded of that you're not isolated from your context, but you're brought in. And so part of this topic is obviously trying to understand a form of contextualism that doesn't eliminate the singularity of the object or the autonomy of the object. And so that was done here through landscape moves, through the materiality, through this idea of lifting and constantly being able to see the landscape through it. So it's move up levels. And this simple binary of an object and then the object completely disappears. So it's a fairly simple idea, a competition. That's sort of how we tend to work. But I realized that all of the projects I'm going to show are sort of simple geometries that then are tied into their sites. So this is actually trying out new context on this show. I can't tell how clear it is to read those, but ideally it's readable. This is a second project, which is a project for a development that's on a site, 16-acre site, just north of Houston's downtown, which is a site where the post office sorting facility has been closed and moved outside the city. So there's a small building on this site, which is the old post office sorting building. And then it was a small tower with a big footprint that was for the sorting of all the mail for Houston. And this site is up for grabs, essentially. So we did a preliminary study for how this site could participate in sort of Houston's downtown, but also create a different model for a form of development. And here it's essentially a ring. We call this ring masa, so a massive ring, and that sits on a flint that ties it into the city. So it's actually very similar to the logic of the Witte project. And here you can see this is an image that's simply to show the argument of the project. So the building of the ring, which is office, as commercial as office, as residential, the landscape is knits it together, and how that landscape operates with the tie it to the city. So it's what we found interesting about this site, in addition to the fact that it's 16 acres available in the fourth biggest city in the U.S., is the way that it sits on the edge of downtown, which is sort of defined by this zone, and how it can still participate in downtown through a certain scalar relationship of the building having enough of a footprint and enough of a presence to be able to be identifiable to the city itself. But then also how one can meet the city. So I think that part of what we're looking at today is an interest in just that level between uh, the ground plane and the upper part of any building today, and how one, I mean, it's to say in very traditional terms, it's how one enters into a building or how a building engages the city. But I think that's also a territory that we haven't talked about a whole lot recently as a discipline. And so how does one actually uh, talk about that glue between our singular buildings and the city that collects them all together? So within the ring, this is its own city, you could say. I mean, it's a ring of development with a whole landscape within it that then escapes that ring to reach the outer edges. So it's sort of like a cooking analogy would be if you had a icing between two layers of cake, but you had too much icing, so when you put the second layer on, it starts to ooze through the edges. So you can see here within that a world unto itself, and I think that's part of what we do as architects is define our own worlds, and that's part of what autonomy we would construct. But then how that connects into the city. So you can see these are our easing parts with the possibility of multiple entrances, but also a scale that makes a transition to the street level. How this world exists. And so, like the Witte project, there's a sense of this landscape which continues across. It's contained by the ring in that it's framed by it, but it leaks through because, like Witte, there's a lift, and so this becomes a whole horizon. At the same time, there's a very different sense of being within that ring when you're in the middle there. Not doing anymore. Oh, there are a bunch of slides here that look like they might show up. Okay, so this shows, if you take the ring off, it shows you that that's a postal building that exists on the site. And then there's a large scale horizontal world, essentially. So, and then that's the world above it. So essentially you get the singularity of that building and then the singularity of the ring around it. So here you see that there's a series of figures that define that front edge along here with a sort of deep front that faces the city, and then a series of figures that are within the project in the back. So the world is in the front that forms the whole horizon there. You can see that as there are 8 or 9 different figures that form that landscape, but this shows how each one is different in terms of creating a different world at the street level and how that brings you into the world of the whole complex. Now, whether this fits as an idea of what Hanig is talking about, I think is part of what we're trying to address and think about right now in our office. And I'm trying to think about just sort of, I would say generally in terms of given that architecture is a field where we don't have, especially in the US, much public work, how can even private commissions, so this is a study for a developer in Houston, how can even private commissions operate in that way as a sort of public thing in the way that she's talking about in her argument. And I think something that forms an identifiable ring on the horizon of Houston and that then has this possibility of a way of redefining the infrastructure at that level maybe is a way of addressing that. You're seeing sort of work in progress in that really. third project I'm going to talk about is the house that we finished in Houston. So it's a much smaller version, let's say, of this. The easy way of understanding its geometry is it's a cube with a hole in it. It's actually two scoops. But this is a house with a circular courtyard. It's a pretty simple house, actually, brick house in Houston, a circular courtyard. And you can see the diagram that so it has a circular courtyard, but it's actually two scoops coming in the ground floor from the street and then the upper floor from the back, and they coincide, the two things that coincide, and the drum of the center forms a circular courtyard in the middle. And that small move of sort of geometry of addressing that cube creates an incredibly varied world that offers what we call wobbly axes. So instead of the courtyard being something that controls an axis and helps hold things in place, sort of solidify things, the circular courtyard, the windows across this, create different views that never quite fix. And so a fairly small house and a fairly simple organization becomes very animate in terms of the views that you get. So here you get a view from the kitchen through the other. So there are two moves in the house, really, the circular courtyard and then the fact that materials define spaces that don't necessarily correspond to the geometries within. So we create at the back here. This is the kitchen and dining area. This is essentially a sort of kitchen and family room, let's call it, is defined by the materials of its floor and ceiling, even though it's not closed off with any walls. So the idea that materials can form rooms as much as walls can form rooms. So you can see that the pale blue creates the ceiling that continues to the kitchen as a slate floor. And then a bigger view that shows that. So that's this space here. Again, materials define the space of the entry, so that even though none of these spaces are closed off, they're still defined by materials to allow for singular definitions of use that then overlap and bleed into other things. The views that you get across with so part of the desire to do a courtyard building was that development in Houston, like here, is well, in Houston it's more uncontrolled, and so you can build right up close to the lot lines, and you never know what your neighbors are going to do. So if you want to control your views, the best way is to create your own world, actually, and so creating that through the courtyard, but also then placing windows in strategic positions so that you don't see the gargantuan things that are going up right next door. So there's just three different sizes of windows that create the possibilities of all those different views. And the possibility of seeing from room to room through placed windows, and again creating your own world. And the back of the upstairs goes down to the front there. The last project I'll show is one that just broke ground in China. It is it's an environmental leisure center, or sort of business center, let's say business and leisure center, for a very interesting client. She's a woman who developed shopping centers in China and then has decided to help preserve this area of highway, which is just outside Changsha, which is an enormous city in China. And highway area is an area that has a lot of organic tea plantations, a very beautiful landscape that's just outside this extremely large, really creative city. And so she's interested in preserving some way that the farmers and the tea planters in this area can maintain an existence and not be pushed out by commercial development. This is the project that actually was sort of the backstory of the object that we showed in Chicago. So this is a part where I don't really have to talk. It's an interesting time. It's been a long process. The first into it, first a site in the program. So, I mean, that's actually a true story, and it's been over a long period of time, and she's been very nice to us. She's actually paid us through all those processes, so I don't want to badmouth her in any way, but really this was this sort of bizarre situation where this building kept moving from, so we started with a building that was dealing with its context and views to an incredibly beautiful countryside, and it got uglier and uglier, so we started closing in more and more on itself. And we were doing this while we were designing the house, and so you can see certain overlaps. But we essentially said, okay, we we turned to thinking about it as an architectural problem because those were parameters that we could put on the project. And so we thought of it as, okay, a big room. And we weren't interested in it just being universal space because we wanted to have some sort of definition, and also universal space has been done. Let's say we did it really well. It's hard to improve on that. So what would be the project today of dealing with flexibility of space and form, program and form, and how those intersect. So like the house, we thought of putting essentially a series of courtyards, or three circular courtyards in this project, created by slots, overlapping slots, and they end up creating this kind of puzzle piece of the building that you end up having a small space, let's say a medium-sized space, a large space. So you get a variety of spaces that allow for different kinds of programs, given that the programs were to be defined by this client. And it means that the architectural problem is the precise definition of those geometries. And I think that's a real, that again goes to why we need to continue talking about objects and materials and the stuff that we deal with, and take pleasure in it and realize that it's actually something that we have a certain expertise in. So we do take pleasure in the kind of obsession of these courtyard spaces and the design of the slots that create them. And so creating the precise geometries that allow you to have these different spaces that result in the building. And then the different worlds that happen from that. So that through those very few geometric moves, you get a series again of views, like what happened in the house, that create multiple spaces and multiple relationships across spaces, so that the spaces aren't isolated as singular rooms. And again, it's a sort of question of the autonomy question being brought to the level of the room as opposed to the level of the building in the city. And so it's a three-level building. It's not that big. It's not that complicated in certain ways. But the kind of possibilities that result from that combination of geometries and that combination of views through the glass walls on the inside. So these are the studies of mapping out just different materials and how they would intersect. There's obligatory slide that shows the voids. And the idea that through different lighting arrangements and through different floor arrangements, again, you can create more relationships than just the relationships that come with geometry and form. And so the possibility that materials also define uh, architectural relationships and programs. We created its own site by essentially burying the building in a series of trees, a grove of trees, uh, and that creates different relationships then with the exterior, which is an idealized grove of trees. We're hoping it can be a sort of a bunch of accents that we're not sure yet. It's essentially its own exterior. And you can see that you can actually through a series of simple spaces, you can offer up a lot of different possibilities of how this can be used. It's still unclear what the program will be, like meeting rooms, event spaces, eating spaces, kitchen spaces, and the idea that you can have similar worlds that also affect one another inside and out. It's a little too much sort of like holy lighting in these images, but you get the idea. Still working on my rendering strategies. And again, so material and lighting, how ceilings, reflected ceiling plans can create um, uh, spaces within spaces. So universal space can be overlapped essentially with a series of different possible uses or understanding, so that even the small space can actually be understood as part of a whole zone. So it's not just isolated. If there's an event going on, this could be isolated to here, or it could be understood as relating to this whole zone, like right down here, again, through the secure surface. And the world that you end up with, right? The possibility, and I think that is my last slide. So it's distracting enough to leave you mesmerized, so that you can come up with questions on your own. But I thank you for your patience. Yeah, as my former students know, I expect questions to be asked at the end of the lecture. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. This is something that I'm still working on. So you can also just shout them out.
In the last three projects, you described all of them as being their own world. Used kind of the same line for each one, and I couldn't help but think back to the start of your lecture where you showed the Jenks chart, Alejandro's chart, and the other global chart, and finally the most recent chart, I guess the one at the GSD. Um,
Are you part of that? You must be.
um, no comment. I'll get my participation will maybe be revealed through my question. So I'm wondering, um, in some ways, the Jenks chart and the Alejandro chart all attempt to sort of create their own world or inward-looking world. I mean, the Houston house, I guess I found the most interesting, the way you described it as you can build right up to the lot line, so you don't know what your neighbors are going to do, so you sort of look in. And I actually think the GSD show maybe sort of navel gazes to the most extreme. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are, say, on autonomy, but in kind of this new world, say, of maybe creating a broader audience.
No, I think that's a good question. I mean, I think that I think I think a house is a difficult one to do that with, right? And um, especially with again development. I mean, you should see the stuff that's around that house. It's a neighborhood that was built
Sure.
in the 40s. Yeah, I'm sure you can imagine, right? And so I think that what we did, let's say, so it's not entirely um, anti the world. So you can actually look in. Um, it's not. There's no real protection from the street. There is one small translucent piece. It's a glass shade, essentially. There's one translucent piece because the owners will notice it. You could see from the street right into their kitchen. And so we've kind of compromised on one. It's like a small band that you can see the actual stove. And I think that the degrees of how you negotiate that relationship, and again, I'm interested in a very normative question, which is the relationship between the entry and the street. And I think Central Post, the big rectangle in Houston, does that through this negotiated leading edge, right? And I think that that's a way of dealing with the broader public constituency of the buildings. If you're asking about the broader public understanding, because I think that I think that Alejandro's map is, you could accuse it of navel gazing in terms of it's a discipline that's trying to understand itself and kind of, let's spend time talking among ourselves about ourselves. At the same time, it's actually trying to map out different approaches to the discipline that I think engage, and it's actually different degrees of engaging audiences. So I think that as a discipline, there are moments when we have to talk about what we do among ourselves. I mean, this lecture is not really something that many other people would be that interested in hearing. I'm hoping you will, but it's a disciplinary audience, and yet I think we do have to actually think about how our buildings engage their contexts and engage different audiences who consider them. So that's what the CCTV, I think, is interesting for having different possible readings of it, depending on where you're seeing it. I'm answering different versions of what I think your question was. I don't know if I answered.
I mean, the first Jenks chart is interesting to me because it's the only one where he attempts to chart the future.
Yeah.
And so a lot of these other charts seem to map the present, and I guess if you think of them from the, yes, they're for us, for the discipline, so the audience is limited. But I guess I wonder how, with your fascination of those charts, how you might see them kind of as a way to kind of reach outward.
Yeah. I mean,
or if you don't even think that's necessary.
I think future prognostication, right, is very challenging. It's sort of I think the Jenks chart is extraordinary, and he did capture some things. He did manage to sort of capture the future in some ways. I think that I think it's actually okay for us to talk as a discipline about the moment right now, and I mean, I admire the effort as long as the effort doesn't become just a kind of supermarket, and that's where. So, and I do think that, so to Alejandro's credit and Guillermo, I think that they really did try to find 11 different categories of how one could deal with politics. You can disagree with them, and I don't agree with all of them. I don't agree with all the offices they chose. I don't agree with where all the offices are placed. But I think it's a very useful chart for generating a conversation and getting us to think. The before speech, the GFD show, I think, isn't trying to it's not making that daring step of corralling, which I think Alejandro tried to do. Yeah, that part I definitely caught.
Yeah, exactly. That was clear to everybody.
No, I think that, I mean, I do think that was, I think that's not helpful, right? But I do think that the idea of corralling is helpful in terms of opening a discussion. So and I do think I'm actually kind of tired of our field shitting on itself, right? I mean, we spend a lot of time taking each other down, and so that's where I am impressed at the attempts to try and offer something up. um, I think it's more interesting if it's not trying to be an argument about the GSD. So I share that with you. But I'd like to see some promise in that. And I haven't finished up, so.
So I have the mic now. I wonder if you would just like make connections between a few points that I'm not sure if I quite see the path. So it starts with, sort of the politics of the moment and like where's architecture in that? And then you made this distinction between autonomy of the object and autonomy of the discipline, and then brought in the interesting question about the public, making publics or something like that, that basically we were caring for, and that really had as much to do with the object, I think. I think we were trying to say, okay, our objects could in fact have this public agency of some sort. And I wonder but then interestingly, what we saw are a series of projects that aren't public projects in the traditional sense at all. Absolutely. So you found this entry connection to the city thing. I wonder if you just like elaborate a little bit more on that thread.
Sure.
Like, do you think the object actually can play a politically agentful role, or is it and what happens with the discourse in that?
I definitely think it can, although agentful isn't a word, but
agential is what people say, which I think is also horrible.
Yeah. I do think that the object can. I think the urban object can engage an audience and multiple audiences. And so, yeah, I think that it. I mean, I think any architect, if architects don't believe that that buildings can have an effect beyond their single clients, then that's kind of bad. So I think as a kind of basic understanding of architecture, but also I think that's part of what we're interested in fostering. So I do think that again, partly through their geometry, their legibility, their geometry, and then the nuances of how that geometry is addressed in terms of inside and outside. As simple as that. I think that that's how we can engage different audiences in the city, and then different audiences within a building or a complex, depending on the size, scale.
So every time the mic goes to the next person, the last person has one more thing to say. Sure. I mean, one of the things that I think about with the role of the public caring for the infrastructure, and in our kind of conversation about how that public care is deteriorating, is what do we think of that when we make private roads? I mean, when Disneyland becomes completely defunct and actually not fantastic, fantasy based anymore, but looks decrepit, that's like, we can't do anything about that. That's not our world to work in. But that's the kind of imaginary we presented with private means to a public. Same with Nike when it's moved on to somebody else.
No, I think that, I mean, I'm not sure if I'm going to answer that, but I think that the idea that so these are all private buildings. This one probably is the most public out of them of all, but they are all, I mean, this is also a private client. And yet, I think that their engagement with the city, let's say the responsibility of the building and its overt design with the city, the caring of it, I don't know. I mean, one would wish that every building would be well cared for. The convention center in Toul that Jean Nouvel designed is shut down for a month every year so that they can replace every torn seat. Would that every one of us would have a client like that, right? And would keep things from looking a little aged. But that's, we don't have that. We can only hope that there's a sort of public responsibility at the urban level. But I do think that if buildings have an attention to that space between the street and the entry, that renders inevitable some attention to that being maintained. I don't know. Maybe that's just naively optimistic.
I want to.
Michael?
That I guess is the topic I think I'm curious about, and so what I'm going to offer is a kind of interpretation of the work, because I know you've been responding to Colin Rowe for a lot through the architecture. I remember back when I saw you guys lecture, I think like 2004 or 5, it was like the X and all that, and there was a lot going on in relationship to Rowe. Am I wrong?
Yeah, but that's okay. Keep going.
Okay,
That's,
so
it's all right.
So I'm gonna summon.
The X house it has to do with processes. It doesn't have to do with.
Oh, it wasn't that one. Okay,
Yeah.
but anyway, here I'm gonna throw some Rowe at this, like which is that you know, for him the terrace, you know, the village garage would have been something that would have had like a pictorial facade, and somehow summon up kind of the formal idea of the building, right? And there, you know, you're looking at the garden facade, and you're looking at an entry to the terrace, which is private. And I'm just looking at the entry to a set of terraces, which are resoundingly public. Like also in the other house, there's a kind of attitude towards inviting people deeper into the plan. So my question is, if for, and this is really just like projecting, and maybe it's a change, maybe it doesn't. Like, could you say that if then the sort of interpretive, critical gesture of the relationship to, let's say, a facade, an entry, front door, and form, was to form, and they left behind the question of formality, so like actually how you would conduct life, that maybe you guys are engaging in the lived-in part, which is to say, like, it's not form, but formality. Like, there's a kind of informality or some measure of formality. Like, that it's more of a kind, what's engaged about this autonomy is, if I'm not, do you see what I'm trying to do?
I do, actually, and as a fan of wordplay, I also like the introduction of formality into a talk that definitely engages with the formal. So I think that may be a useful way of engaging that. I think that's helpful. I mean, it's pretty simple. It really is a question of, you know, can these be read as objects that have their own autonomy as buildings, their own understanding of buildings, their own legibility, and yet are tied in and offer different readings as opposed to a single reading that's for a single public and to contain with a couple of reflections. Got it. Excellent.
If architecture as an object is there to kind of construct a world for a multiplicity of subjects, then do you think, as a discipline, that architecture is cold calculus in mind?
No, see, that's exactly, I mean, that's why people say if you talk about the object, you must be irresponsible and mean and cold-hearted. No.
Right, so where do you, when you, like, when we run through this GIF of like 100 different narratives of possible worlds, right? Do you write these things down? Are they like little anecdotes for a possible visitor? Like, do you have a hypothetical sentiment in mind? Where does the emotional response?
No, I don't offer my emotional response onto the audience, but I think, yes, we do offer different scenarios. We do hope that projects don't have a singular scenario attached to them. I don't know if that's a question of sentimentality, but I think that it's the idea of sort of possible ways of living in a space. I think I mean, it maybe goes to what Michael's saying as a kind of informality or formality. It's ways of living.
I think it touches kind of to what you were getting at, I think, with promoting caring in order to
sustain our public works, our social environment.
Yeah, I mean that's my naive belief in the fact that at some point we're going to realize that we all have to kick in a little bit to our public engagement as
Taxes,
citizens.
yeah.
And I don't know if that's really going to happen, but I think that's only part of Honig's argument is the caring for. But that is, I mean, it's true that we, we, if a bridge breaks, we have to repair it, and that comes from shared tax money.
The month out of the theater is design tax.
It's a design, exactly. Which, I mean, but we aren't the French and don't have that design tax. There are more questions.
Thanks.
When you talk about the object or its autonomy, in a sense, and by showing this very refined and restrained object, in a sense, we are left with some of the criticism which comes where the object doesn't speak a lot of languages, doesn't speak of multiple use, because it's very hard to read. It's kind of inside talk among architects themselves. And you can talk to other architects, but the reading, let's say, if you want to engage the public, you will hit the wall at a certain point. With a big object, small, doesn't make a sense. To me, the CCTV, it's still a big object, and by looking at it from two different sides, it doesn't really change that much what it is, how it is in the city, and so forth. And secondly, you also talked about that you're tired of architects shitting on each other, and I feel they don't shit enough. There's just like, or they should use different toilets to shit in, because there's not enough engagement between architects and the public, and there's a lot of cozy, let's say, discussions among architects. They never leave their safe space. So I feel there's just, maybe I'm at the point where I'm just had done with these architects too long, and feel that I want to go out and feel the beat of other things, because it's kind of like self-congratulatory the way the whole organizations are set up, the curatorial system is worked out, the AAA. I mean, I could just go on and on.
No, I mean, all of us as academics benefit from that certain, let's say, the autonomy. The sort of, yes, we have, and you've been part of that world too. I mean, we all have that. I understand that. I would take umbrage, a phrase that I've always liked, with I think that I think that to have buildings that are refined or restrained in their geometries and their material palette doesn't necessarily mean that they're only speaking to a group of architectural aficionados. So I think that there's the palette, the certain brick that we used for the house in Houston, or I think that the idea of the skin for the Ujda project, even if that was a very preliminary design, are ones that actually speak very possibly to a broad audience. And I guess I feel a little bit, one should be careful about not assuming that a broad audience can appreciate those kind of geometries and materials. I think the other thing you mentioned is scale, and I think that's actually a really valid issue, that the scale of work, the scale of projects, so the scale of a project like CCTV is a big scale, and so how do we deal with that? So you can mask that as creating a bunch of little buildings and pretend that it's not a big building. I think that's one strategy. I don't have a problem with engaging big scale in cities. I don't think that that's I don't think that's something that we need to shy away from. I think it's an interesting challenge. So I think that you're raising very interesting points, but I absolutely think that we engage a public audience is what we do. Jeff had a question, and then Heather, or Heather and then Jeff.
It's so great hearing you talk like you and Ron on this that. So thank you for being here. Great talk. I was late actually because I was driving Peter Zellner home. We were both teaching thesis at the other campus across town, and we were actually talking about autonomy and and the, the commercial practice of architecture, reflecting on that, and that was actually a subtext to your lecture tonight. And at some level, doing something that's autonomous resists commercialization in some way. Something disciplinary, like if you're Peter Eisenman and you're transforming a house in a Caroline drawing, it's not necessarily a marketing tool or something. You're not going to sell that necessarily. And the other end of the spectrum would be like the shopping center photorealistic rendering of something with balloons and figures. And I wonder how much some of the autonomous design work is, and I'm not speaking about actually your work in particular, I'm saying in general, could be just masqueraded as, could masquerade as commercial through representation, and maybe give the impression that it fulfills certain that it's compromised in some way, and maybe it's not, or degrees of compromise through how it's portrayed.
Yeah,
and
no,
I think REM is actually pretty good at that in some ways. OMA is pretty amazing at being able to maintain this autonomous object and still represent it as though it's.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a whole nother topic, but it's an interesting one in terms of how we communicate. I think it goes back to some of the things that Mark was saying on the table of how we communicate with an audience. I'm not sure I buy into the idea that okay, it's like you have a film that you want to be an art film and also be a Hollywood blockbuster, and somehow you're going to have that all be within the same movie. So maybe it's like the subtitles are in Finnish or something. Right? I guess I feel that representation is a whole other topic for how one speaks to an audience that we don't, that may be a client or may be a broader public. I think architecture does the same thing, and I think we have to always be conscious of what spectrum you're dealing with at one level or the other. But I would also advocate that they coincide. It's the same project as opposed to having a representational project sneak in something underneath.
Right, and the degrees of autonomy at some level, degrees of compromise.
The chair is stealing the mic.
My question's related to this, though, which is when you talked about engagement, you talked about the public sphere, and you talked about context. In most particularly, and I was thinking about your modes of representation as something that's actually the direct kind of material link between the autonomous project and the engaged project. In that you are working quite assertively with the graphic and with the drawing, and that the kind of layered conditions of the drawing and the layered conditions of the graphic, which are translated to material or arrays of lighting or arrays of occupation, are the kind of way in which your work very assertively bridges between modes of communication and media that are germane to architecture and those that exist in other public spheres. And so to me, it's kind of not really whether the project is addressing context, but it's the way in which it pulls the graphic in as something that can cultivate audiences. And so I
think that's a great answer to Jeff, actually.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think
but
it's
I mean, it was
a,
my question, but
I
it
think
answered
I think
Jeff's
that's a nice way of addressing that question and sort of. I mean, I think there's something so we just had our thesis reviews, and we had a student who used gaming software to have these perspectives that were line drawing perspectives that had moving pieces or people moving through. It was a very simple move, and it was incredibly striking as a novel way of how do we deal with representation, how do we capture the fact that buildings aren't fixed, that we want them to be lived in, whether that's a question of sentimentality that you were bringing up, Kevin, in terms of scenarios, and are there ways that we can do that without it being overly complicated or overly dignified as a rendering technique? I think that's all very interesting. I think that the sort of simple graphic of the stuff going on here that gets you all busy is one version of that. But I think,
unlike Jeff, I'm not talking about just how you represent a drawing, but how you produce its effects
project,
as spatial and material.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I think that's really nicely put.
I guess that's a good way to end.
I think that's a nice place.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you all
so much.